We would like to thank the fun and challenging Best Fiends for their support. If you've listened to the show for a while, you'll know that I'm obsessed with Best Fiends. So stop crushing the same old candy and try a puzzle game with something fresh to offer. Download Best Fiends free today on the App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R, Best Fiends. Enjoy the show. August 19th, 1992. Menasha, Wisconsin. After leaving her workplace, 20-year-old Laurie Depies drives to her boyfriend's apartment complex and parks her car before she vanishes without a trace. Even though witnesses heard her vehicle pull into the lot, they do not report hearing or seeing anything unusual, and the only evidence is a cup of soda left on top of the car's roof. 18 years later, a convicted kidnapper named Larry DeWayne Hall confesses to abducting and murdering Laurie, but no corroborating evidence is found to support his story, and Laurie remains a missing person. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be exploring an odd missing persons case, the 1992 disappearance of Laurie Depies. This case was suggested to me about 2 years ago by a listener named Beth, and it's one of those frustrating disappearances where it seems like the victim literally just vanished into thin air. Right before she went missing, Laurie parked her car at her boyfriend's apartment complex, but even though something obviously happened to her right after she exited her vehicle, no one heard or saw a thing. There would be a major development in this case years later when a convicted kidnapper named Larry DeWayne Hall, whom I have discussed on previous episodes about other unsolved cold cases, confessed to murdering Laurie, but her body has never been found, and investigators lack the corroborating evidence to file charges against him. Opinions about Hall's involvement are sharply divided, as some people believe that Laurie was abducted by someone she knew, which could explain why there were no signs of any struggle and why she didn't scream or cry out for help. Indeed, some suspicion has been directed at an individual from Laurie's personal life, and on this episode, I'm also going to be exploring an unlikely connection between this case and notorious convicted murderer Stephen Avery of Making a Murderer fame. Since there is just so little evidence to work with, the possibilities about what happened to Laurie are endless, so we're going to delve into a number of different scenarios. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the disappearance of Laurie Depies. Our story begins in Wisconsin in 1992, and our central figure is 20-year-old Laurie Depies. Laurie grew up in Chilton alongside her parents, Mark Depies and Mary Wagner, but when they divorced, she moved with her mother to Appleton in 1987. After graduating from high school, Laurie attended the University of Wisconsin Fox Valley, but decided it just wasn't for her, and dropped out after only 4 months. Laurie would get a job at the graffiti clothing store at the Fox River Mall in Grand Chute, and moved into her own apartment in Appleton, as she planned to start saving up money while she decided what she wanted to do with her life. At around 9:50 p.m. on the evening of August 19th, after finishing up her shift at the graffiti store, Laurie and one of her co-workers locked up for the night and walked to Laurie's gray 1984 Volkswagen in the parking lot before they each drove off and went their separate ways. Laurie was planning to go see her 22-year-old boyfriend Mark Trubenbach, who lived in an apartment complex in the nearby town of Menasha. 20 minutes earlier, Laurie had called Mark at his apartment to let him know she was running a little late because of computer problems at work, and during her shift's dinner break, Laurie had picked up a ring at the mall jewelry store, which she was planning to give to Mark. Mark was hanging out inside his second-floor apartment with his sister Lisa and Laurie's best friend Victoria Cavins, and since it was a pleasant evening, he decided to leave the balcony door open. Sometime between 10:15 and 10:30, the group said they could hear Laurie's Volkswagen Rabbit pull into the parking lot outside, as it always made a distinct noise because of a muffler issue. After they heard the sound of a door slam, they were expecting Laurie to walk up to the apartment, but after 3 to 5 minutes, she still hadn't arrived, so Mark decided to go out into the balcony to check on her. He could see the Rabbit parked in a spot about 30 to 40 feet from the apartment, but there was no sign of Laurie, so the group decided to go down to the parking lot to look for her. When they arrived at the vehicle, they discovered it was locked, and a styrofoam cup which was partially filled with soda was resting on top of it. Laurie had been carrying an overnight bag and her purse, which was believed to contain the ring she had purchased for Mark earlier that evening, but these items were not inside the vehicle and have never been recovered. After performing a search of the neighborhood and finding no trace of Laurie, Mark contacted the Menasha Police Department to officially report her missing. There were no noticeable signs of struggle at the scene, and even though Mark, Victoria, and Lisa had reported hearing the Rabbit drive into the parking lot, they claimed they did not hear any screams or noise to indicate that Laurie had been the victim of an abduction. Indeed, no one from the apartment complex reported hearing or seeing anything unusual that night, and there were no witnesses who could confirm having seen Laurie or any vehicles leaving the parking lot. According to everyone who knew her, it was very uncharacteristic of Laurie to climb into a vehicle with a stranger, which made them wonder if she left with someone she knew. Mark and many of Laurie's other friends were questioned and passed polygraph tests, so none of them were considered to be suspects. The only piece of evidence investigators had to work with was the styrofoam cup of soda found on top of the Rabbit, as it contained a thumbprint which did not belong to Laurie. Police submitted several sets of elimination prints to rule out the possibility that the thumbprint belonged to the mall clerk who had sold Laurie the soda earlier that evening, as well as any friends or police officers who might have picked up the cup by mistake. The width of the print made investigators believe that it belonged to a man, though they cannot say so with 100% certainty, and it has never been matched to anyone. Laurie's disappearance generated a lot of publicity in the Wisconsin media, and wound up getting national exposure when her parents were invited to be guests on the Oprah Winfrey Show, which aired an episode about missing children in November of that year. Laurie's story would also be featured on the news magazine program Inside Edition in January of 1993, but this exposure failed to generate any promising leads. Over the next 2 decades, there would be no activity on Laurie's bank accounts or social security number, which made authorities suspect that she was a victim of foul play. However, there would be a major development in November of 2010 when a convicted criminal named Larry DeWayne Hall confessed to being responsible for Laurie's abduction and murder. Now, I've already talked a bit about Hall's background during my previous podcast episodes about the unsolved 1991 abduction of Angela Hammond and the 1992 disappearances of Cheryl Levitt, Susie Streeter, and Stacy McCall, aka the Springfield Three. But here's a quick refresher. Hall is currently serving a life sentence for the kidnapping of a 15-year-old girl named Jessica Roach, who vanished in Georgetown, Illinois on September the 20th, 1993, after leaving her home to walk to the store. 6 weeks later, Jessica's decomposed remains were found across the state line in a remote cornfield in Vermilion County, Indiana. An autopsy showed that she had a broken jaw, but her remains were seriously mutilated when a farmer unknowingly ran over them with a combine, so it was impossible to determine Jessica's exact cause of death. 1 year later, in November of 1994, investigators looked at Larry DeWayne Hall as a potential suspect after numerous girls from Georgetown reported being followed by a suspicious-looking man in a van. After being questioned about his possible role in Jessica Roach's death, Hall broke down and started crying when he saw her photograph, and finally admitted that he killed her before he made a signed confession to her abduction and murder. Now, due to jurisdictional issues, Hall was not actually charged with the crime of murder, as he had abducted Jessica in Illinois and disposed of her body in Indiana, but the authorities could not pinpoint the exact spot where she was killed. So Hall wound up being charged with 1 count of kidnapping for the purposes of sexual gratification, and since he had crossed state lines, he went on trial in federal court in June of 1995, where he was found guilty of the crime and received a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The following year, an appeals court ruled that Hall should be given a new trial because the trial judge erred by not allowing the testimony of a psychologist who claimed that Hall's mental condition had led him to falsely confess. But regardless, Hall still wound up being convicted again when he went on trial for the second time. By the time he confessed to Laurie Depies' murder, Hall was incarcerated at the Federal Correctional Complex in Butner, North Carolina. Earlier that same year, author Christopher Hawley Martin had published a book about his crimes titled Urges, A Chronicle of Serial Killer Larry Hall, which discussed Hall's potential involvement in Laurie's case, as well as the unsolved disappearances of many other young women from the Midwestern United States. Even though Hall has technically only been charged and convicted of one crime, there's been a lot of speculation that he might be a serial killer, as Hall himself has specifically mentioned abducting 39 women between 1980 and 1994, most of whom he wound up killing. It turned out that investigators had looked at Hall as a potential suspect in Laurie's case almost immediately following his arrest for Jessica Roach's kidnapping. A search of Hall's van turned up a list containing the names of young females who were missing or confirmed dead, and one scrap of paper had the words Laurie Fox River written on it, even though Laurie was spelled Lori instead of Laurie. Even though Hall lived in Wabash, Indiana, he spent a lot of time traveling through the Midwest in order to participate in Civil War reenactments. In fact, investigators confirmed that Hall had registered for a reenactment in Kaukauna, Wisconsin, which was located only about 13 miles away from Menasha and took place on the weekend before Laurie went missing. Even though Hall had registered for the event, it could not be conclusively confirmed if he was actually in attendance, but while Wisconsin authorities wanted to question him about his potential role in Laurie's disappearance, they were unable to do so until all of his appeals for his conviction for Jessica Roach's kidnapping were exhausted. For years, Hall refused to speak to the authorities about the case until he decided to make a full confession in November of 2010. While investigators declined to discuss any specific details about Hall's confession with the media, Hall himself agreed to an interview with the Associated Press in May of 2011. According to Hall, he first encountered Laurie while purchasing a t-shirt at the graffiti store at the Fox River Mall. He said that he asked Laurie out for pizza, but she declined because she said she was going to a friend's house and didn't have time. So Hall decided to wait until Laurie's shift ended and followed her from the mall to the apartment complex in Menasha. When she parked her car in the lot, Hall said that he parked his van on the street and called out for Laurie, asking her if he could show her a photo album he had of antique cars. Since Laurie recognized him from the mall, she agreed to join Hall inside his van to look at the album, but when she told him she wanted to leave, Hall injected her with some anesthesia he had obtained from a friend who worked at an animal hospital. Hall then said that he blacked out and could not remember what happened next, but when he came to his senses again, Laurie was tied up inside his van, and he proceeded to sexually assault and murder her before burying her body in a wooded area. Hall said that he decided to confess to the crime because he finally wanted to provide Laurie's family with some closure, stating, quote, "I'm very sorry for what happened. I wish to God it had never happened. Since I'm taking medications now, I'm a lot different than I was in '92, end quote. Hall directed the authorities towards a remote location in south-central Wisconsin where he claimed he had buried a total of 4 bodies, including Laurie. Hall did not provide any specific details about these other 3 alleged victims, only that one of them was a young boy he had accidentally hit with his van. However, an extensive search of this area failed to turn up any human remains, and all attempts to transport Hall from North Carolina to Wisconsin to assist with a search effort have been unsuccessful. Investigators initially found Hall's confession to be credible because he reportedly provided details about the case which were not public knowledge, but thus far, they have been unable to uncover any corroborating evidence to prove that he was responsible for Laurie's disappearance, and no charges have ever been filed. As the years have gone by, both of Laurie's parents, Mary Wagner and Mark Depies, have openly expressed their skepticism that Hall murdered their daughter and leaned towards the idea that she was harmed by someone she knew. In January of 2019, both Mary and Laurie's former boyfriend, Mark Trubenbach, agreed to make an appearance on an episode of the talk show Dr. Phil in order to discuss the case. The episode also featured a phone interview with Laurie's best friend, Victoria Cavins, who shared her own suspicions about a young man from Laurie's personal life. This person's name has never been released publicly, but he was just 19 years old at the time Laurie went missing and worked at The Gap, which was located just across from the graffiti store where Laurie worked at Fox River Mall. Originally born in Illinois, this young man had a juvenile criminal record and had spent part of his youth at the Rawhide Boys Ranch in New London, which provides residential programs for troubled young offenders. Groups from the ranch would sometimes make visits to the Fox River Mall, which is how this young man first became acquainted with Laurie, and he would ask her out on numerous occasions. In fact, on the same day she went missing, he joined Laurie for both of the breaks she took during her shift, and asked Laurie out again, and he was reportedly quite upset when she turned him down, and told him that she already had a boyfriend. At the time, this young man shared an apartment in Appleton with a coworker, who claimed that he returned there later than usual that night and was acting strangely. About a week after Laurie went missing, he attended a get-together with friends and raised some eyebrows by drawing violent and disturbing images, including a man standing behind a girl with a bloody knife and stabbing her. According to Victoria, the girl in this drawing was dressed in clothing that was very similar to what Laurie was wearing on the night she vanished, and police have since taken it into evidence. Investigators did not actually learn about this person's suspicious behavior until months after Laurie disappeared. When he was questioned, he was reportedly very uncooperative, refusing to take a polygraph or discuss his whereabouts before he returned to his apartment on the night Laurie went missing. By the time he was questioned, a vehicle he had owned during that time period had since been crushed and sold for scrap, so it cannot be searched for potential evidence. This man later moved to California and has never been completely ruled out as a suspect. So after nearly 30 years, there are still no conclusive answers about what actually happened to Laurie Depies. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, I would like to take another moment to give a shout out to Best Fiends. If you've listened to this podcast for a while, you'll know that I'm obsessed with playing Best Fiends year-round, but we've now entered a brand new year, and one of my resolutions for 2022 is to become even better at Best Fiends. Best Fiends is a game that has it all, including an amazing storyline, collectible fiends, and tons of fun puzzles. I know it bears repeating, but it's very difficult to put down, since it's quite possibly the best puzzle game out there. If you have no Wi-Fi, then it's no problem, because you can play Best Fiends whenever and wherever you want with offline mode. The last time I spoke with you folks about this game, I had recently passed level 2300, and I was hoping to pass the milestone of level 2500 by the end of 2021. I'm proud to say that I achieved that goal, and I'm making it a New Year's resolution to reach level 3000 by the end of January. Since Best Fiends has literally thousands of levels with more added all the time, there's always a fresh challenge waiting whenever you need a mental pick-me-up. So download Best Fiends free today on the App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R, Best Fiends. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of this episode. Anyway, this is undoubtedly one of the most frightening types of missing persons cases, as we have a victim who went missing in a very narrow window of time in a public parking lot while she was less than 40 feet away from her boyfriend's apartment. And even though it seems obvious she was abducted, no one saw or heard anything, and there was virtually no evidence to work with. While we have numerous witnesses who could confirm that they heard the sound of Laurie arriving and parking her Volkswagen Rabbit, it almost seems like after she exited the vehicle and locked it, she literally vanished into thin air. If Laurie was the victim of an abduction, you would assume that someone would have heard or seen something, such as screaming or the sound of another vehicle speeding away, but that's just not the case, even though this was a warm August night where many of the apartment complex's residents had their windows open. Mark Trubenbach even said that whenever he kept his balcony door open, it was not uncommon for him to distinctly hear other people's conversations in the parking lot below, yet he heard nothing here. So this suggests two possible scenarios. Either Laurie was kept quiet and forced into another vehicle at gunpoint, or she willingly climbed into a vehicle being driven by someone she knew and had no inkling that this person was planning to harm her. Since Laurie's purse and overnight bag were missing, this suggests that she was carrying them when she exited her own vehicle and still had them on her when she left the scene. She also still had enough time to place the styrofoam cup of soda on top of the car and lock it before something happened, and it would have only occurred within a span of around 3 to 5 minutes, since that's when Mark walked out onto the balcony and noticed the parked vehicle. For many years, Mark declined to do any interviews about the case, but when he appeared on the Dr. Phil episode a few years ago, you could tell that Laurie's disappearance completely destroyed him, as he suffered from depression and terrible health issues for years. Mark claimed that at one point, Laurie's mother Mary confronted him and said, quote, "This is all your fault," and while Mary said that she does not remember this incident, she does acknowledge that she was not herself during that time period because of the trauma of her daughter's disappearance. Believe it or not, even though Mark was never considered to be a suspect by police, there were still people within the community who believed he killed Laurie, which is completely ridiculous since he had two other witnesses who were with him the entire time. This is yet another painful ordeal that the families, friends, and spouses of missing and murdered victims have to experience, as sometimes these completely innocent people will be accused of being responsible, even when there's zero evidence to support this, or they've been ruled out as suspects. I guess this is just a defense mechanism people have when it comes to unsolved cold cases, particularly ones like this, where there doesn't seem to be any logical explanation for what happened. But sadly, sometimes it only takes a split second for someone to vanish without a trace forever. But before we talk more about the known facts of this case, I want to take a few moments to discuss something which I hinted at during the intro, as Laurie Depies' disappearance has an unlikely connection to one of the most controversial murder cases of the modern era. I'm sure most of you have heard of Stephen Avery, who is currently serving a life sentence for the murder of 25-year-old Teresa Halbach in Manitowoc County, Wisconsin on October 31st, 2005. The crime captured a lot of notoriety because it took place only 2 years after Avery was exonerated and released from prison after serving 18 years for a rape he did not commit. But of course, there are a number of people who believe that Avery was framed for Halbach's murder and wrongfully convicted for a second time, which is why this story has been extensively covered on the Netflix series Making a Murderer. Now, since Stephen Avery was serving time in prison for the rape conviction in 1992, he can obviously ruled out as having any involvement in Laurie Depies' disappearance. But last year, an interesting thread was started on the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit by a poster under the username TempTedious, who looked through all the case files for the Halbach murder and found some surprising links between Laurie's case and Stephen Avery's older brother, Chuck Avery. Well, I'm not going to go into too many specifics about his background, but let's just say there are a number of disturbing allegations against Chuck, which include sexually assaulting and strangling his own wife with a phone cord. He also has a documented history of exhibiting creepy behavior towards women who have been customers at the Avery family's auto salvage yard, which include asking these women out on dates completely out of the blue. But if you look through all the documentation from Teresa Halbach's murder, you'll find 2 separate reports about 2 separate eyewitnesses who attempted to link Chuck with the Laurie Depies case. One of them documents a phone conversation between a Calumet County Sheriff's Department investigator named John Dietering and a man named Gordon Schneider, who hailed from Laurie's original hometown of Chilton and, quote, went on to indicate that he had information that Chucky Avery lived not far away from where Laurie Depies lived. Schneider went on to indicate that, to his recollection, Depies wore her hair in the same manner as the Halbach girl. End quote. Schneider also mentioned that a former spouse of Chuck's named Kathy Callies, who died in 2002, had the exact same hair color as Laurie and Teresa, and he also brings up the possibility that Chuck could have planted some of the blood evidence against his brother Stephen in order to frame him. Investigator Dietering concludes the report by saying that he attempted to use a law enforcement search engine to find out if Chuck ever lived in Appleton, but was unable to determine if this was the case. The second report documents an interview between Calumet County Sheriff's Department investigator Wendy Baldwin and a man named Dolan Olschlager, who hails from Kakana. The interview is about a completely unrelated topic until Olschlager suddenly asks if an Avery ever lived by Laurie Depies. When Baldwin says she's not sure and inquires why Olschlager is asking about this, he replies that he was a friend of Laurie's. The report states, quote, Dolan said there was a man that Laurie always talked about being creepy and always watching her. Dolan said he had heard that it was one of Stephen's brothers that lived by Laurie and was wondering about that. End quote. Baldwin then told Olschlager that she would relay this information to the appropriate investigators for that case, but that's pretty much all there is about this Chuck Avery-Laurie Depies connection. Now, there are conspiracy theories out there that Chuck may have been complicit in Teresa Halbach's murder, but I'm not going to go into that, since that's a whole other can of worms which you need an entire podcast to discuss. But if you were to compare photos of Laurie Depies and Teresa Halbach, you do have to acknowledge that they have a resemblance to each other and do have very similar hairstyles, just in case you're considering the possibility that Chuck might have had a type. Of course, the connection between the two cases is tenuous at best, though I do find it interesting that two separate witnesses from two different towns each told different investigators at different times how they heard that Chuck or an Avery brother once lived near Laurie, and I'd be really curious to know how this rumor started. I know that Dolan Olschlager said he was a former friend of Laurie's, but there's no explanation in any of the documentation about who Gordon Schneider was or why he was speaking to the Calumet County Sheriff's Department to begin with, but since he lived in Chilton, perhaps he knew Laurie and her family when she was younger. But my biggest problem with this whole connection with Chuck is that I see no indication that he ever lived in Appleton, which is over an hour away from Manitowoc County. From what I can tell, the Averys are mainstays in Manitowoc County who have pretty much lived their entire lives there, and I found nothing to indicate that Chuck would have been a resident of Appleton in 1992. Yes, the stories about Chuck's behavior around women are unsettling, but if Olschlager's story is accurate, and Laurie often made mention of a creepy guy who was always watching her, well, we do know that there was someone else in her personal life who exhibited that sort of behavior, and we're going to talk about him in more detail later on. Since Stephen Avery's arrest for Teresa Halbach's murder was pretty huge news in Wisconsin, I think it's possible these two witnesses may have just been trying to attempt to link the Avery family to other unsolved cold cases from the area, even though they were basing it on nothing more than some uncorroborated rumor that Chuck once lived near Laurie Depies. Unless I hear additional evidence to suggest otherwise, I see no reason to believe that Chuck has any connection to this case, but I still found the aforementioned Reddit post to be interesting enough to share on this podcast episode. When you're dealing with a missing persons case with so little evidence to work with, any angle is worth exploring. When you take the whole Chuck Avery angle out of the equation, the only two specific individuals who have been pushed forward as promising suspects in Laurie's disappearance are Larry DeWayne Hall, who flat out confessed to her murder, and the unnamed 19-year-old who kept asking her out. Larry DeWayne Hall has become something of a mythical figure in true crime circles, since he's suspected of being this calculated serial killer who may have been responsible for killing up to a few dozen women, yet he has never technically been charged or convicted of murder. I mean, yes, the only reason he was not charged with murdering Jessica Roach is because of jurisdictional issues, but given how thoroughly this guy has been investigated, it is surprising that he's only been conclusively linked to one crime. In previous podcast episodes, I've talked about his viability as a suspect in the disappearances of Angela Hammond and the Springfield Three, but while no conclusive evidence has ever linked him to either of those cases, you cannot rule him out either. Hall is definitely not what you would call an intelligent man, as he only has an IQ of 80 and did not do well in school, but he did have a very devout interest in true crime stories and forensics. Since he worked as a janitor and was very knowledgeable about cleaning products, one theory which has been pushed forward is that he was particularly skilled at covering up his crimes and ensuring that he would leave no physical evidence behind which could be traced back to him. Of course, if you look up Hall's mugshot, his most distinct feature is his large, prominent sideburns which resemble mutton chops, which he likely grew because of his fascination with participating in Civil War reenactments. It's well documented that Hall loved to drive around the Midwest to attend these reenactments, so if he was a serial killer, this might have given him the opportunity to kill multiple victims in multiple states, and he would subsequently leave the area before anyone could link him to these crimes. Civil War reenactments have pretty much been the linchpin for tracking Hall's movements during the early 1990s and figuring out his potential culpability in unsolved cold cases. One of the main reasons he seems like a plausible suspect in Laurie Depies' disappearance is because we know he registered for a Civil War reenactment that took place in the nearby town of Kaukauna only days before Laurie went missing, so this provides a potential explanation for Hall being in the area over 350 miles from his home. Now, even though Hall has claimed that he was responsible for the abduction and murders of up to 39 people, he's always been very vague about providing details. I mean, he claimed that there were 3 other bodies, including a young boy, who were buried at the same location where he disposed of Laurie's body. But he did not provide any information about who these other victims might have been, and since no remains were found at all, this does raise credibility issues with Hall's story. Other than Laurie, one of the only victims Hall is specifically named is 19-year-old Tricia Reitler, a freshman from Indiana Wesleyan University in Marion. On the evening of March the 29th, 1993, Tricia vanished while walking back to her dormitory from a supermarket, and her blood-stained clothing would later be found in a nearby field. Well, just over 1 year later, in May of 1994, Hall popped up on the radar as a potential suspect when he was pulled over by police, and newspaper articles about Tricia's case, as well as a piece of Indiana Wesleyan University stationery with her name on it, were found inside his van. While he was being questioned by the authorities, Hall confessed to Tricia's murder, and even offered to take them to a section of Grant County near the Mississinewa Reservoir where he said he buried her. But when they arrived there, the search turned up nothing, as Hall said he became confused, and with no other corroborating evidence against him, Hall was released from custody and dismissed as a quote-unquote wannabe serial killer. However, when Hall was arrested for Jessica Roach's kidnapping 6 months later and made a full confession to her murder, he also claimed to have abducted and murdered 3 other women, including Tricia Reitler, but without a body or any other supporting evidence, he was never charged with these other crimes. To this day, Tricia has never been found, though Hall allegedly made another confession to her murder to a fellow prison inmate in 1998. Much like with Laurie Depies, there is really no hard evidence to implicate Hall in Tricia's disappearance other than his own confession and some notes and newspaper articles about the case, which were found inside his van. But considering that Hall had material related to a lot of unsolved cold cases involving young women, does this mean he was directly involved in all of these crimes, or does he just have his own personal interest in them? Investigators did give some credence to Hall's confession to Laurie's murder, because he supposedly revealed details about the case which were not public knowledge. That may very well be true, but while it's possible that the original confession Hall provided to the police was much different, the story he shared during his interview with the Associated Press has a number of details which are hard to believe. So to recap, Hall claimed that he crossed paths with Laurie while she was working at a clothing store at the Fox River Mall and asked her out for pizza, but she told him she didn't have time because she was meeting up with friends. Hall then decided to wait around for Laurie until she closed the store, and then he followed her to the apartment complex. When Laurie climbed out of her vehicle, Hall pulled up nearby and convinced her to join him inside his van to look at a photo album of antique cars, and that's when he injected her with animal anesthesia and drove away. Okay, while the scenario would certainly explain how Laurie was abducted from the scene without anyone hearing or seeing anything, I have a hard time imagining that she would willingly climb into a van driven by Larry DeWayne Hall. I mean, I don't want to criticize the guy's appearance or anything, but just look at Hall's mugshot and his giant mutton chops. If a guy looking like him showed up at your workplace and asked you out, and then suddenly reappeared later that night after following you to your boyfriend's apartment complex in an entirely different town, would you climb into a van with him? I mean, I have no idea whether or not Laurie had an interest in antique cars, but looking at a photo album of them does not seem like a convincing reason for her to decide to join Hall inside his van. Laurie's friends and family have stated that she would have gotten into a vehicle with someone she knew, but not with a stranger. If she recognized Hall as a customer who had asked her out at her store earlier that night and believed he was stalking her, I think her first instinct would have been to scream, run, or call out to her boyfriend for help, particularly since she was only 30 to 40 feet away from Mark's apartment. Look, I'm definitely not going to say with 100% certainty that Hall was not responsible for Laurie's disappearance, but if he was, I certainly don't think the events played out like he said. In the past 11 years, no corroborating evidence has ever been found to support Hall's story, and even though investigators seemed pretty confident he was the perpetrator following his confession, it seems like many people, including Laurie's parents, no longer believe that's the case. The fact of the matter is that it's not uncommon for convicted criminals who are serving life sentences without the possibility of parole to confess to crimes they did not commit if they want to be the center of attention again, particularly if they have nothing left to lose. I also find the timing of Hall's confession to be interesting, as he spent years refusing to speak to investigators about Laurie's case, but finally admitted to murdering her only 6 months after a book about his crimes was published. At the time this took place, Hall had a falling out with his family, and no one was visiting him in prison anymore, so one investigator has speculated that Hall may have decided to confess because he was lonely and wanted to talk to someone. And even though Hall is claimed to have committed dozens of crimes, there's a reason why he might have decided to admit his culpability in Laurie's disappearance, which took place in Wisconsin. All the other cases where Hall has been looked at as a potential suspect have occurred in states which have the death penalty, whereas Wisconsin does not. So regardless of whether or not Hall's confession to Laurie's murder is false, he knows this is the one case where there is no risk of execution if he is charged and convicted. Like I said earlier, I will not completely discount the possibility that Hall was the perpetrator, but I do think it's possible that he simply decided to confess for lack of anything better to do. Overall, I am more intrigued by the theory that Laurie was abducted and killed by someone she knew, which would go a long way towards explaining how she vanished from that parking lot without anyone seeing or hearing anything. So now we have to talk about this 19-year-old who had a romantic interest in Laurie during that time period, even though we don't know all that much about his background. He did have a juvenile criminal record, though it's never been confirmed if it was for anything violent, and while there doesn't seem to be any direct evidence against him, it would make perfect sense if he was the perpetrator. He worked in another store at the same mall as Laurie, asked her out on a date hours before she went missing, and apparently did not take it well when she told him she had a boyfriend. It's been established that he did spend time with Laurie on her dinner break, and she also used this opportunity to go purchase a ring for Mark, which could have very well been the sort of thing which set this guy over the edge after he was rejected. Since he obviously knew where Laurie worked and what time her shift ended, he easily could have waited around in the parking lot until she left and followed her to the apartment complex. It's also been reported that he showed up late to his apartment later that night and has never accounted for his whereabouts during that window of time. And of course, there's also the disturbing account of him making drawings of a man stabbing a woman who appeared to be dressed like Laurie when she was last seen. Now, if he followed Laurie to the apartment complex parking lot, would he have been able to lure her into his own vehicle without causing a scene? Well, even though Laurie had repeatedly turned him down when he asked her out, she apparently did so in a very polite fashion and was known for being as nice as possible with other people. So while Laurie might have been a bit unsettled if she noticed this guy had been following her, she may not have believed he was capable of violence and decided to speak with him inside his vehicle before she was abducted and subsequently murdered. Now, you might be wondering how a 19-year-old could essentially commit the perfect crime without leaving any evidence behind and do such a thorough job of disposing of Laurie's body that there's been no trace of her for nearly 30 years. Well, remember, this guy was not even brought to the police's attention until months after the fact, and they learned that the vehicle he would have been driving during this time period had since been destroyed. So he would have had ample time to cover the whole thing up and get rid of potential evidence. When they discussed him on the Dr. Phil episode in 2019, it was mentioned that he was essentially living off the grid, so I'm not sure if anyone even knows his current whereabouts. I guess the final clue we need to discuss is the unidentified thumbprint which was found on the styrofoam cup on Laurie's car. It couldn't be matched to anyone at the time, and I'm assuming it did not match Larry DeWayne Hall, because that would have placed him at the scene, and probably would have been the one piece of evidence which compelled investigators to file charges against him. It's also not clear if any comparison was ever made between the thumbprint on the cup and the 19-year-old's thumbprint. But I have to wonder if it has any relevance to the case, because if Laurie placed it on the vehicle while she was locking it, would the perpetrator have even had a chance to touch it while in the midst of abducting her? However, I can definitely understand why investigators have placed so much significance on it, since it's pretty much the only piece of physical evidence they have to work with. After all these years, it sounds like the authorities are back at square one, as during her Dr. Phil appearance, Mary Wagner stated that even though her daughter's case was technically still open, the actual investigation seems to have ground to a halt. And that's very frustrating, given how the case seemed to be on the verge of being solved when Hall confessed over a decade ago. Unfortunately, it's possible that Hall's involvement is nothing more than a smokescreen which has distracted everyone from the real perpetrator, whether it be the aforementioned 19-year-old or someone else who has managed to stay off the radar this entire time. If Hall did this, then at least we can take comfort in knowing that he's going to remain locked up for the rest of his life, though it would be nice if investigators could find some definitive evidence to prove it, or most importantly, recover Laurie's remains. So if you happen to have any information on the unsolved disappearance of Laurie Depies, please contact the Menasha Police Department at 920-720-7109. That's 920-720-7109. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. This past month, I released a bonus episode about the death of a man named Joseph Mulvaney, a murder victim whose skeleton was discovered inside a Foot Locker 3 decades after he was killed. And if you're an Unsolved Mysteries fan, you're probably familiar with their segment about this story, which is often referred to as Gabby's Bones. I'm also going to be dropping the occasional exclusive bonus Patreon episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, and we recently released an episode in which myself and my co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, discussed another case from Unsolved Mysteries, the 1982 murder of Perman Gilbert. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Echo Foxtrot, Rachel, Kimberly R., Bianca S., Ashley B., Sharon S., Kay Moss, and Gretchen P. Thank you all so much for your support. I'm also pleased to announce that The Trail Went Cold has been added to the lineup for Podcast Row at 2 CrimeCon events this year. So provided that it is safe enough to travel, I'll be appearing at CrimeCon 2022, which is being held at Paris and Bally's in Las Vegas from April the 29th until May the 1st. If you would like to purchase tickets, we already have our own personalized promo code to receive a 10% discount off a standard badge. Please visit crimecon.com and enter the promo code TRAIL. I'm also hoping to appear at CrimeCon UK, being held at the Leonardo Royal Hotel and Spa in London on June the 11th and 12th. If you would like to get a 10% discount on tickets to this event, please visit crimecon.co.uk and enter the promo code COLD22. In addition, I wanted to provide another reminder that I hold live streaming sessions on a platform called Get Vocal. Every Thursday night from 7 until 8 p.m. Eastern Time, I host what is essentially an after show for each week's podcast episode, where I have an interactive discussion about the featured case from said episode and answer questions and address comments from listeners. I always include a link to these sessions in our show notes, so be sure to check there for more information or visit getvocal.com. That's GETVOKL.com. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.